I had no idea that National Bookstore had such an incredible origin story. And I think you guys are gonna love this because it's a legit rags to riches story. So our main character here is Socorro Ramos, or Nanay Koring as she's more commonly known as. And at one point, she was peeling off paper off of old cigarettes so that they can be reused to make new cigarettes. And she was being paid what, like 5 cents per pack of cigarettes? And did you guys know pala that National Bookstore started in World War II when the Japanese were here? And I don't know if you can really call it the bookstore during that time because due to censorship during the Japanese occupation, books weren't really the wisest thing to sell. And so the story of Socorro Ramos is all about how she navigated World War II during the Japanese period just by selling anything that the Japanese soldiers needed. And this in itself is pretty inspiring. It's a story of setback after setback after setback, and then we realize that all these setbacks were no match for the tenacity of Socorro Ramos. My name is Chris Guerin, and this is Brand Origins. So we go back to 1923. Socorro Cancio was born to a poor family in Santa Cruz, Laguna. She had 6 siblings. So her mom and lola had this tiny stall in the market where they would sell all sorts of stuff. Like they would sell slippers to broomsticks. But the thing is, she shared how during that time back in the province, people had a tendency to make utang. So they would buy on credit, but then a lot of them would fail to make good on their promises, like they would fail to pay. And so due to all these uncollected payments, her lola's store couldn't sustain it any longer, and so they were forced to shut it down. This whole experience, it made a mark on the young Soccorro, because in an interview, she said that this instilled in her a lifetime horror of credit, and that she, as much as possible, would not want to get involved with credit. Now, the closure of their store made it really difficult for them financially, and so the only bright option that they had was to head to Manila. When they got there, her sisters were able to find work at this gum factory, and Soccorro actually worked there as well, but only during the summer break because she was around 10 years old pa lang at this point. But even then, she was already taking all sorts of jobs just so that she can support her family. So at this point, she was sewing buttons on shirts, she worked as a waitress at a restaurant, but one particular job that stood out was when she was working with cigarettes. So she had this one job where she was tasked to peel off the paper off of old cigarettes because apparently these were going to be used to make new batches of cigarette sticks. And so with this whole side hustle, she was being paid 5 cents per pack of cigarettes. This whole thing, it was very doable. It was just extremely time consuming. And so what the young Soccorro did was she delegated this to a couple of other kids. And she told them that she would also pay them 5 cents, but this time for 2 packs of cigarettes. And so because of this, her superiors were so impressed at how fast she was finishing the job. And she was making a little more pa because they rewarded her with incentives by doing it that fast. As soon as she finished high school, this is when she would start working at this one particular bookstore. And this is where we get into the whole love story of Soccorro. So the district that she and her family were living at also happens to be the same place where the Ramos family was living at. Now about the Ramos family, well, they were doing better financially compared to the Cancios. I guess you can consider them middle class since they were living comfortable lives. So what happened was, Socorro's brother ends up dating and eventually marrying one of the Ramos daughters. And so together, the couple ended up starting their own bookstore, and they called it Goodwill Bookstore. Is that familiar? Socorro's brother was fully aware of her work ethic, and so he asks her to come and work for them at Goodwill Bookstore as a sales girl. They needed her because they were opening a branch at Escolta at the Panciteria Nacional. And no, this is not where they got the name for National Bookstore. Now, her sister-in-law, whom her brother opened a bookstore with, she also had a brother, and this was Jose Ramos. Jose Ramos was a bookkeeper, and he would go to the bookstore often to see his sister. And since Socorro worked there, every time Jose Ramos visited, they would frequently see each other. And they started to hit it off, and eventually started to fall in love with each other. But keep in mind that at this point, Socorro was still very young. I mean, Jose Ramos was 14 years her senior. But they didn't care, and Jose Ramos asked her to marry him. I don't think that it's much of a surprise that Socorro's parents and family weren't happy about this. In fact, they were so against this that they sent Soccorro back to the province to make sure that she's as far away as possible from Jose Ramos. But this wasn't enough to stop Soccorro though, because I guess she just really loved the guy. And so she decided na, against all odds, she was gonna find a way, she was gonna head back to Manila, even though her family absolutely forbid her from doing so. And so what she did was she took the only money she had with her, which was 11 pesos, and then she headed back to Manila. I don't know how she made it there with 11 pesos, but she did say that it wasn't easy. Doesn't this whole thing kind of sound like a teleserye episode? Socorro Cancio and Jose Ramos got married in 1940. And because of this, Socorro's family kind of disowned her for a while, up until she gave birth to her twin sons, but more on that later. Since Socorro always wanted to put up her own bookstore, and since she's already had experience working in one, after they got married, she and her husband decided to put up their own shop. They picked a small spot near the Escolta bridge, and with a starting capital of around 211 pesos that time, which is around 55 to 60,000 pesos today, they set it up. Now let's talk about the name. Now, Soccorro recalls that they didn't actually know what to call their store. But then remember that Nanay Coring worked as a sales girl before, and she recalls how she used to always see the word National on the cash registers at that time, because I think that's the brand of the cash registers. And that's how she came up with the name National Bookstore. Side story lang you know, when I was little, I really thought that National Bookstore was like the official bookstore of the Philippines. Like, diba, we have a national bird, we have a national hero, we have a national flower. I really thought that National Bookstore was the national bookstore of the country. But anyway, so they put up National Bookstore. Now, keep in mind that the pair got married in 1940. Take note that Nazi Germany has already invaded France at this point, and World War II in Europe was in full swing. In December 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines. And so if you think about it, Socorro and Jose Ramos could not have chosen a more challenging time to start a business. I think this is the equivalent of starting a hotel business in February of 2020, just when the COVID pandemic was starting. But I think that this is where we really see the versatility of Socorro Ramos as an entrepreneur. When the Japanese were here in the Philippines, running a bookstore was probably one of the most difficult things to do, since the Japanese were very strict when it comes to censorship. So she shared how every single book now needed to be reviewed by the Japanese. And since most of the books were imported abroad, there were a lot in those books that the Japanese didn't like. Pages that mentioned democracy, freedom, and anything about Western culture, these pages were ripped from the books. And so those thick books started to look like thin flyers after the Japanese went through them. So Socorro Ramos realized that during that time, there was really no point selling books anymore because they would all go to waste lang. And so what they did was they just stored the books and they decided to sell anything else that people needed. So they ended up selling notebooks, ball pens, paper, candy. Basically, National Bookstore started out selling anything else but books. So I got this from her interview with Bo Sanchez, where she shares about the slipper story. Okay, so that time though, it turns out that Japanese soldiers needed slippers. They were probably tired of wearing their combat boots the whole day. And so Socorro Ramos decided, you know what? Let's sell slippers. So she heads to Divisoria and she buys 6 pairs of slippers. You know, she wasn't expecting much, but at the end of the day, all of them sold out. And so she's like, maybe there's an opportunity here. And so she orders even more slippers, eventually having like 1,000 slippers. And what's amazing was that Japanese soldiers were all lined up outside of her store. I mean, can you just visualize that? I know you guys are aware of the atrocities that Japanese soldiers have done to us during World War II. And so just imagining them lining up to buy slippers, I just never thought of that ever. And there's another story pa. So since Japanese soldiers were starting to become her loyal market, she was thinking, what else can I sell kaya? What else do these guys need? So she discovered that they wanted cigarettes, particularly the Akibono brand of cigarettes. And so naturally, you know, Socorro Ramos being Socorro Ramos, she became a distributor of Akibono cigarettes. And once again, Japanese soldiers were all lined up sa store niya. And then there's another one pa. Someone came to her store and asked if she sold bond paper. And so she asked him na, oh, how many do you need? And the person said, just 3,000 reams. I mean, do you know how much paper that is? And so once again, she went out and searched for a supplier. And to deliver this order, she said that they had to go and use a carretela because gas was reserved for the army. And you can just imagine that this carretela going back and forth to deliver the 3,000 reams because it's a lot of paper. Nanay Coring said, whatever is in demand, I'm gonna order it. Because of her ability to spot and take advantage of these opportunities, they were able to make some money from this. But the problem was they paid in Japanese currency. But this was considered by many as Mickey Mouse money because they weren't really worth much. But then another opportunity came, and I love this story. So around this time, she was pregnant with her twins. And you know that Socorro Ramos was such a workaholic, and she said that around that time, she was only getting around 3 hours of sleep. And she was pretty much doing as many tasks as possible in running National Bookstore. And so finally, her family was able to convince her na stay at home muna since it's the last months of your pregnancy. But then a Japanese wholesaler came into the picture and then asked her if she wanted to buy whiskey. Like, a lot of whiskey. I think that around this time, the war was coming to a close na, and it was kind of clear that the US forces were winning, and they could retake the country from the Japanese anytime now. And so that's why this Japanese wholesaler was in a rush to get rid of his whiskey supply. Now remember that Socorro Ramos had a lot of these Japanese cash, diba? And she figured that if the Americans arrived, this cash would be worthless. And so she thought that, what if I spend this cash on all the whiskey instead? There may be a bigger chance that when the American Marines arrive, they may want a lot of this whiskey. And so she gambled. The Japanese wholesaler was asking for a lot of money for the whiskey, but then she told him that this is really all the cash that I have. And he agreed. And then he proceeded to show her the bodega full of whiskey. Like, it was a lot of whiskey though. And this whole transaction became her final deal before she finally took a step back to rest. Now when the Battle of Manila happened, she said that there were fires everywhere. In fact, even the National Bookstore in Escolta, it burned down. And it's even more scary for her because diba she had a bodega full of whiskey. Almost all of Manila was burning down, and the fire just stopped literally a block away lang from the bodega full of whiskey, as in it was such a close call. When the Americans arrived, her gamble paid off because the Americans bought so much whiskey, and the best part is that they paid her in US dollars. So sure, their National Bookstore branch may have burned down, but now they have some cash to rebuild. They rebuilt in Avenida, and things were doing well, and it was good since the Japanese are out now, they can finally sell books again. But then another setback happened. A typhoon ravaged the country, and since the shop that they built was made of light materials, the roof got blown away, and so all the books they had got wet. I mean, can you imagine how frustrating this is? And so now they're forced to start again from scratch for the third time. Siguro some of us, if we were in her shoes, you would probably be saying stuff like, you know, maybe this bookstore thing, maybe it's not for me, maybe the universe sending me a message. But then they just went for it. They rebuilt a third time and just pushed on. I'd also like to point out that Socorro Ramos already had 3 children, the twins, Alfredo and Benjamin, and her youngest, Cecilia. And as she was running the day-to-day tasks of growing National Bookstore, she was the one helping them with their homework. Like as soon as they would arrive from school daw, she said that she would be the one to prepare the merienda, she would tutor them, and she would even be the one making the reviewer when they had an exam. Now, one particular catalyst for the growth of National Bookstore happened in the 1950s. Socorro Ramos saw the opportunity in greeting cards, and so she wanted to create her own. She wanted greeting cards that showcased the beauty of the Philippines. And so what she did was, she hired photographers and then told them na go and take pictures of landmarks and people in traditional costumes. And these cards, they became a hit, and it became one of their best-selling products. And this leads us to the Hallmark deal. This story was from an article from Esquire magazine. I'm sure naman you guys are familiar with Hallmark. They're the largest greeting card manufacturer in the United States. Okay, so here's the story. So there's this guy, Bob Fraser, and this guy was an executive for Hallmark. And he was set to visit the Philippines because they were looking for a local licensee. Keep in mind that at that time, National Bookstore was nowhere near its size today. And so Hallmark was naturally looking for bigger, more established bookstores. And so Bob Fraser had meetings set, but it was only for those big players. Socorro Ramos knew that she couldn't get a chance. She couldn't even land the meeting unless she does something extraordinary. And that's exactly what she did. So what she did was she waited for Bob Fraser to arrive. So she was just there waiting at the airport, and she made a sign with his name on it. And so Bob Fraser, he comes to her, and that's how they met. As in, she just winged the whole thing. Like, she accompanied him to the hotel, she made her elevator pitch, and she was able to secure a meeting scheduled the following day. She then took him to National Bookstore, and Bob Fraser was so impressed with the local greeting cards that she produced. Now, I don't know if she expected that the local greeting cards that she made would play a role in securing the Hallmark deal, but it just reminds me of this quote: it is better to be prepared for an opportunity and not have one than to have an opportunity and not be prepared. And funny pa kasi Bob Fraser asked her to show him a business plan, and she was like, I don't know, I don't have one. Then he said, then go make one. Then she was like, I don't know how to make one. And so he just started asking questions like how she plans on selling the cards, how she plans to distribute. And she said that at that point, it was clear na Bob Fraser has already made up his mind. And with that, Socorro Ramos secured the Hallmark deal and became the official licensee. And since then, I'm sure you guys know then, it's hard not to spot those greeting cards at National Bookstore. This deal was a catalyst for growth for National Bookstore. There was this vacant lot that Socorro Ramos was eyeing for a while now. It was a prime lot just across National Bookstore, and she's always wanted this. Remember earlier when I was talking about how she was traumatized by the idea of loans? So at this point, after years of saving, she was so proud of the fact that they were able to acquire acquire that lot without taking out a loan. And this would be the spot of what would become the flagship store of National Bookstore for many years. Today, National Bookstore owns a couple other companies under its name. In 1990, they launched Anvil Publishing, their publishing arm. They also own Powerbooks, a specialty bookstore launched in 1996. In 2016, they launched Art Bar for arts and crafts, Noteworthy for stationery and gift items, and Virgie Ramos, Socorro Ramos' granddaughter, founded Giftgate, which has since been acquired. She also brought Swatch to the Philippines, a Swiss watch brand, as well as Hello Kitty when she became the exclusive distributor of Sanrio products here. One thing that I didn't see coming was how the Ramos family apparently has huge investments in the mining industry. Anglo-Philippine Holdings, or APO, owned by them, has investments in United Paragon Mining, Atlas Consolidated Mining, and Philojail Corp. And have you guys noticed that there's always a National Bookstore in SM malls? Well, their partnership is quite strong. In fact, it goes beyond that. In fact, Atlas Mining is owned both by the Ramos Group and by SM. And wanting to give back, Socorro Ramos' grandson, Adrian Ramos, established NBS College. They call it a school for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. They basically converted half of a 4-story mega outlet into this school, and it can accommodate up to 1,000 students. Today, National Bookstore is one of the most iconic brands in the country with over 200 locations. And you know what even makes this more amazing? Socorro Ramos is still around. She's 98 years old in the making of this video. Born a couple of years after World War I, navigates through World War II, and then goes through the COVID pandemic. She's an absolute superwoman. And that's about it. That's the story of Socorro Ramos and how she built the National Bookstore. Help YouTube's algorithm boost my video and reach more people by clicking like, subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing it with your friends. If you prefer shorter videos, follow me on TikTok and on Instagram. Links are in the description.